Gives me great pleasure to introduce Tim Barford, who I've known for quite a while now. And some of you will know Tim as being the organizer of the various Veg Fests, vegan festivals in Bristol, Brighton, London. I'm not sure if there anywhere else you were doing them. He has his own company, which is Yaoh, which does hemp-based products, body stuff, lip balm. I've got some suntan lotion of yours. And in addition, now he's got some vegan magazines out, which may be talking about more over the course of this presentation. So the talk or the discussion is about human rights interacting with veganism, animal rights, etc. I'm not going to explain it to you. I'll pass over to Tim and he can tell you his views. So over to you, Tim.
Great. Thank you, Brian, and good evening, everyone. And thank you very much for joining us. It's heartening to see so many people. It's always nice when people actually turn up for talk. As usual, I haven't prepared it particularly. I've made a few notes, but it's pretty much from the heart, as they say. I will be referring to a few notes just really for accuracy, especially quoting. But it's informal. And I'm not really an expert. You know, Brian mentioned I've been running Veg Fest, running Yaoh for, 20 years. And before that, another 20 years been vegan. So coming on 40 years, pretty much my adult life. It's only really in the last, I would say 7 years that I've really sort of taken a real bit more of an interest. So this isn't really an academic talk. It's more of a discussion. And it's not really, designed to win anyone over or to convert anybody to a different way of thinking or change anybody's opinions or reinforce anybody's opinions either. Really, it's just my own experiences and really how I've seen my own learning of this, kind of interpreting whatever I've learned and why I think that might be beneficial to just basically broaden our understanding of veganism. And I think that at the heart is what this discussion is really about. So I'm going to try not to go on for too long. There's no slides. There are a couple of links I've put up in the chat, which I'd like you to, cut and paste, save for later, perhaps have a look at. In particular, the history. Great set of blogs written by my esteemed colleague, Dr. Roger Yates, who many of you will know, about the sort of growth of the vegan social movement and, how tangible this history is, how close. I'm sure there's people amongst us here tonight who will remember some of those pioneers, some who are sadly no longer with us. But, I was lucky enough to know people like Arthur Ling. And I'm sure one or two people who knew Kathleen Chanaway. She is alive. And I will certainly be referring to, some of the thoughts and some of the pioneers of our social movement. But I should note too that we're talking about human rights, animal rights. These are serious issues, and clearly we know, the battle for human rights, which is always going on, is going on every day, and of course there are some really appalling human rights atrocities that indeed some of our audience here today may well have even experienced firsthand. So I'm mindful that these are serious issues, and of course we know the horrors of the animal laboratories and the slaughterhouses and the factory farms, and it's not always easy to talk in a kind of light-hearted and kind of fun and engaging way about some very serious issues, but I shall attempt to do that. But I should note, just on an accountability note, that the last 6 months I've got quite uncomfortable with some of the stuff, and I think it's because it's really started sinking in. And I've gone through that slightly performative stage that I think a lot of us perhaps go through with our veganism and our animal rights and our human rights, our campaigns and protests. And at some point, sometimes those veils slip, and some of this really sinks in, and we get uncomfortable. And that certainly happened this year. And but that's growth. And I won't be attempting to try and make anybody feel uncomfortable in this talk, given things are uncomfortable enough as they are. But it's a sign of growth. And I think we only have to look at fitness, how we have to get a little bit uncomfortable to make some gains in terms of fitness and health sometimes. But that uncomfortableness is in a way, it's a good sign, because that's how we grow. And I think we are seeing not only a growth of veganism, which is clearly apparent, and a growth of plant-based diets, a growth and a change of individuals, systems, and institutions as we speak. But I think we're also seeing a change within our movement, within our UK movement, especially UK-based. Some of you remember vividly this pretty much very night 7 years ago, when the sort of US, UK torrent of battles was raging over the vegan society. All sorts of stuff was going on, and this sort of tumultuous time. But in time that panned out, and we established, I think, well, I remember from 7 years ago, very much so that animals are at the centre of veganism. And that's key to this talk, is that this talk is very much recognising that animals are the centre of veganism. But by extension, humans are also included in this great scope of veganism, this great scope, this great vision that our pioneers had when the Vegan Society formed in 1944, and we had all these wonderful individuals popping up. And of course, before that too, when we look at the history of human rights, which I'll come to way back, some of the people pioneering vegetarian, veganism, plant-based diets, human rights, trying to combat poverty and illness and some of the real issues that we're facing even today. So I do also just want to say that, trying to suggest that we should replace animal rights with human rights here. This is recognising very much that animals come first in our movement. And I do therefore refer to the Vegan Society definition. My understanding of veganism, which is key to this, is that veganism is a set of lifestyle choices that reflects an animal rights position. And it's that animal rights position that animals have a right not to be used as property that underpins veganism. As a separate to plant-based diets, which, as we know, have fantastic health benefits, whole food plant-based diets, fantastic environmental benefits, and indeed have fantastic potential for growing and feeding a growing population. And of course, all of those encompass human rights, animal rights, but essentially veganism is a set of lifestyle choices that reflects that animal rights position. So that's how I'm approaching this talk, and that's key that we're on the kind of same page. We're very much talking about animals having a right not to be used, and that's all animals, a right not to be used as property. And so, from that position, I do also recognise that human rights has, especially on Facebook, this has caused issues in vegan groups. There's no pretending that we have not seen the weaponization of some of these principles and ideas. We've seen the cynical rise of identity politics, and some fairly appalling episodes within our own communities. And indeed, Brian, I should acknowledge that, as London Vegans admin, you've experienced some of the real first-hand of that. So it's not surprising. I think that there's a number of people who perhaps would say, well, look, veganism is about the animals. We just keep the human issues out of it. We've got a number of groups fighting for various human rights issues. We don't need that in our movement. It gets in the way, it derails, it causes arguments, and we don't need it. We need to focus on the animals, and it's an animals first movement. And you know, that's a very valid concern. It's a very valid and real issue that we are dealing with, as it were. But that shouldn't kind of cloud, you know, Facebook arguments or whatever, shouldn't actually cloud really this kind of fundamental history, development, and the theory, the ideology of animal rights and human rights. I think if we just sort of separate out those a little bit and kind of then put in context, what does this really mean? You know, then it becomes a bit more coherent, if you like. So again, I just underline that I'm definitely not ignoring or pretending for these issues don't exist. It's the opposite. We do have an issue. It's not surprising that a number of people really reject, if you like, human rights coming into veganism and animal rights. But I'm going to refer to a couple of things, and I'm going to try to do so fairly briefly, so you can look up later, and you can make your own opinions. Obviously, a lot of you will already know a lot of this stuff. It won't be new, and some of it may be a useful refresher. But when we look at two things, I think we should look at how the definition of veganism, and how that sort of developed over the last 1,000 years or so, particularly in the last 70, 80 years, the advent of the vegan social movement, as we know it, with the grouping together and people coming together and forming a movement, trying to make a change individually, systemically, and institutionally. So when we look at the veganism as a definition, I know we all kind of pretty much adhere to the 1979 definition that the Vegan Society Council came up with, and we still kind of generally refer to today. And I think I think it's a really good definition. I think it really encompasses a real spirit of veganism. It really defines it in a really strong way. And veganism is a philosophy and a way of living, which we talked about, who seeks to exclude, as far as practicable and possible, all forms of exploitation of and cruelty to animals for food, clothing, or any other purposes, and by extension promotes the development and use of animal-free alternatives for the benefit of animals, humans, and the environment. So that's the definition. Now, it's true that, obviously humans are animals. We understand that, but we also understand that the Vegan Society refers to the difference between human animals and non-human animals. And I think it's safe to say that when the Vegan Society defines here, as far as possible, practical, all forms of exploitation of and cruelty to animals, we are referring to non-human animals here. Because clearly later on in the definition, it clearly refers to by extension. So by taking this principle, by extension, promotes the development and use of animal-free alternatives for the benefit of animals, humans, and the environment. So there's the key part of the definition, where it very clearly defines that humans are the beneficiaries of veganism, as is the environment. And therefore, by extension, we include humans in the benefit of our choices for humans and the environment. So it's animals, humans, and the environment. Animals come first, but by extension, humans and the environment. So that's how I choose to interpret that definition. And I understand that people have different interpretations, and there are different definitions of veganism. This is the one that we choose to adhere to. It doesn't mean it's the be all and the end all. But that's quite interesting, because that brings me to my next point, really, which is when you look at our pioneers, and I think we always should, look at the founders of the social movement to see how we define the social movement. Who were our founders? I've posted a blog there. There's a series of blogs that you can read later. Some of you may well have seen already. refers to the birth of the vegan social movement in 1944 and onwards, during the first 30, 40 years, up until the birth of, or the development really, of animal rights philosophy in the 70s. But if we look at the key players, as it were, you know, obviously Donald and Dorothy Watson. We know that Donald was a conscientious objector, very much a human rights advocate as well as animal rights. He talks about taking, you know, the original vegan group is not religious, but they took the thou shalt not kill seriously. So it's a kind of extension of a human right, thou shalt not kill, to include animals. So, you know, the original writings of Donald, you know, he talks about the moral evolution of humanity quite a lot, and how veganism is the greatest movement that ever was. And so Donald very much, and that was even as recently as just 20 years ago, not long before he died. And, you know, Donald had a very clear vision that veganism was a very broad evolution, if you like, of, it's indeed his words, a moral evolution of humanity. So when we think about that, you know, that has to include human rights. You know, we cannot have a moral evolution of humanity on the back of slave labor. That don't work. That's not an evolution. That's just a different set of oppressions. Just moving sideways. You know, it's a bit like vegetarianism in a way. You know, I know we all as vegans get this. Oh, I'm sure a lot of us went vegetarian. There's a point where we thought, actually, we're eating eggs and cheese. That's just like kind of the same, isn't it? That's like oppression. It's oppression. We want to end oppression, don't we? We want to kind of get rid of this. And so I would certainly argue strongly that a veganism without human rights, it's not really veganism, not as the pioneers developed. And when we look at Leslie Cross, who was another very clear vegan pioneer in the sort of 50s and 60s, talked again about, you know, this quote here about, at rock bottom, veganism is the most recent of the periodic surges by which have marked the tide of freedom ever since history began. And veganism is the center to upward growth of humanity. Again, I just say that, you know, veganism is central to the upward growth of humanity. So again, Leslie was talking about, you know, basically this is that we're entwined. And again, he talked even about the freeing of slaves and serfs. He talked about a new world, a new human to inhabit that world. So, you know, we were really talking about a moral evolution of humankind. And to believe in the right to be free means inevitably that we grant the same rights to others. I'll just say that again. To believe in the right to be free means inevitably that we grant the same right to others. And that's the importance of human rights here. And I love that word inevitably. Because, you know, if you think this through and you take off the shackles of your mind, as it were, that stop you thinking this through, maybe for whatever reason, it's true. Inevitably, liberation has to include humans as well as animals. Otherwise, it's not really total liberation. Kathleen Janaway, of course, was a huge advocate of what we now recognize as a sort of intersectional framework of nature. Kathleen Janaway talked about linking the compassionate desire to avoid animal products with the rational use of world food resources, and did a lot of work joining up those dots between different forms of, you know, climate justice, human justice, and animals justice. But from a very much, you know, before it was even defined, because it's only really in the 70s when you got the likes of Tom and Nancy Reagan, who were, of course, anti-Vietnam War protesters. So again, human rights ambassadors, if you like, who went vegan through the influence of Gandhi, who again was a huge human rights advocate. And Tom and Nancy kind of wrote those books in the 70s and 80s and developed that philosophy of animal rights, if you like, which underpins veganism and our current movement, even though it's a little bit forgotten about at times, we're sort of putting it back in the frame. So these there are other, because the women of the movement, Elsie Shrigley and Eva Batt and Faye Henderson, and of course we know less about them because they were less recorded. Of course, that reflects the sexism of the times, if you like. 70, 80 years ago, their voices were less heard and recorded. But what we do know is that Elsie and Eva and Faye were all fighting for women's rights, absolutely. And of course, this, again, you look at the history of the suffragette movement, BUAV, I think it was the BUAV, but it was an anti-abolition, a vivisection group. I'll get my history right here. But going back to, I think, into the late 1900s, it was formed in Edinburgh, that then developed into a suffragette movement. So there we have an animal rights and a suffragette movement all very much tied up too. So our kind of history, and then even if you look back further, and I won't go on too much about history, but I will just mention that if you look back further, some of the names, and there's a nice blog on Global Vegans that looks at the history of animal rights and human rights. People like al-Mahari, the esteemed Syrian poet of 1,000 years ago, who was writing about human and animal rights. A gentleman called by the name of Roger Crabb, who was a pacifist in the 16th century. Johann Conrad Bessel, who is a human rights and animal rights. They're all kind of animal rights, advocating for plant-based diets, really. Vegetarianism, non-violence, pacifism, but breaking the poverty cycles. James Pierpont Greaves and Amos Brunson Alcott were two esteemed vegetarians who set up a load of schools and education for the masses and such like. We got all these kind of, and even when we look at, even recent developments, I say recent in terms of history, Gary Francione, abolitionist approach is one of the 6 precepts is very much a sort of anti-racist, anti-sexist, anti-ist position, a consistent anti-oppression position. One of the things that really sticks out there is, of course, our famous, well-loved and much adored, and just over 70 now, Ronnie Lee, who founded the ALF, the Animal Liberation Front. It sort of changed a bit in the 80s and 70s, because, one of the things Ronnie Lee said when we talked about what sort of went right and what went wrong was that, we didn't really want people to like us, So that original sort of ALF movement was very much like, actually, we don't want people to like us. And I think that's at a time when it shifted a bit. And I remember that shift as a vegan in the 80s, where, animal rights became quite associated, you may well remember, with quite media, kind of drama and exposes, all sorts of glamorizing these, sort of dramatizing these liberation of animals that was going on a regular basis. But Ronnie was right. It kind of did take a turn, and there wasn't, as it were, an ugly face. Then the kind of cupcake vegan came along and changed all that. So suddenly we had lots of vegan events and lots of fluffy, I guess it was part of all that. And but I was vegan in the 80s and 90s, and kind of a way, I found the animal rights thing was quite oppressive in a way. Now, of course, I fully support that animal rights position. Isn't it refreshing to see people like the Beagle Camp and such like springing up, Camp Beagle, and there's an AXR, and there's a hunger for protest again, and kind of putting that animal rights in. But so actually, I would move on. So just looked at some of the history, but briefly, then what about in practice? All right, so if we come on and say, okay, well, human rights matters, what about in practice? Does that not just get in the way? How do we live? We've got enough restrictions, surely, with being vegan. Do we have to go through everything with human rights too? It's like, well, yeah, we do, actually. Because let's think about it. It's not fun, is it? Think about those human rights atrocities. For what, a bar of chocolate? You're kidding me. Oh, you don't want that in a cupboard, do you? Anyone would want the inside of a cow. You don't want a bar of chocolate on the back of that level of exploitation. That's not vegan. It can never be vegan. How could that be vegan? Explicitly says, avoid exploitation wherever practicable and possible. And what could be easier in this day and age of going on to the Food Empowerment Project list and looking up your bar of chocolate and going, oh, there's one. Guess what? Mood-free, Plamel, you know, we've got all sorts of really good, there's plenty of others, really good brands of chocolate widely available that bothered to source chocolate and cocoa that's in line with human rights. Okay, and it's as easy as going on there and looking it up. And there's no excuses. We don't need to make excuses anymore. It's as easy as going on for 1 minute on the internet, and that's it. And if we're saying, oh, supermarkets, blah blah blah, I say, yeah, okay, look, there's a lot of vegan supermarkets now. You can't get inspired for choice, the vegan kind. You know, there's lots of online supermarkets cropping up. We're not having to. You know, we can uphold, we can aim for a more consistent level of where we choose to spend our pound note. Dapper, you know, they're in the chocolate article. Dapper are a great example because they're what we call bean to bar. So Dapper is a South London born boy from a Ghanaian family. His family in Ghana have plantations of cocoa, and they're growing cocoa, and then they're shipping it, and they're producing it, and they've got a vegan bar, high end at the end, and they control the whole process. And they're getting a fair trade all the way through. Everybody's getting looked after. It's environmentally friendly. It ticks all the boxes. That's how easy these solutions are. But it's not just, you know, chocolate. There's all sorts of other areas, and the Rainforest Alliance, food empowerment projects are all really good for this. You know, we're beginning to think about things like pea protein. You know, there's a lot of pea protein coming in. What about the standards of farming and pea protein? Of course, well, guess what? We've actually now got a load of British grown hemp protein coming in. So, you know, now these guys are paying £1,500 a hectare to UK farmers up and down the country and processing in a new 500,000 plant in Warminster. And Yaoh on our stuff in the, yeah, just sort of throw that bit in. But there's an example where we know there's fair trade, good standards, human rights are respected. We can make those purchases safe in that knowledge when we want to buy, you know, these products. I was really just interested yesterday about one of the things you probably know about post-Brexit is we've got a shortage of farm workers in the country to pick fruit. And I saw that one of the owners of a strawberry farm was saying how he's had to do some of his own picking. Now he knows what it's like again. He's going to grow a lot of his strawberries on raised beds so that people don't have to bend over all day to pick the strawberries for us to eat. These are practical, living, working examples of where human rights really comes into the picture. We should be looking all the time, not necessarily obsessively. That's I understand. We're all limited. We've all got to make our own lines, and we're all got our own limitations. But I think by default, we should be looking always, try and do the right thing, really. That's what human rights are about, is upholding the rights of humans to be treated fairly. And you know, that's just being a good person, really. That's trying to treat animals fairly. That's trying to treat the environment fairly. That's trying to treat everyone. It's a holistic thing. And I don't see how we can exclude humans from the vegan solution. And there's another reason too that we should really be mindful of this, is because, you know, if we want to see the global spread of veganism, we have to be mindful that, you know, the UK is a country where we have a lot of human rights a lot of privilege, if you like, a lot of benefits. And we're seeing this disparity as we speak with vaccines, recovery from COVID, you know. Great news for England. Oh, the UK recovery is, what did the Chancellor say 2 days ago? Yes, better than expected. Great. There's a lot of countries where that's not so. And if we want to really spread veganism, we have to be mindful that it's us in these Western countries that are beneficiaries of these human rights abuses quite often. And that's not necessarily our fault, but it is our responsibility to acknowledge that, be accountable for it, and look to find solutions to that, because we don't want to perpetuate that any more than we want to perpetuate the abuse to the billions of animals that we wake up to daily. And if we really want to see veganism go global, we have to listen to those voices that are asking us to be mindful. So when we see projects like Chilies on Wheels and, you know, Food Empowerment Project, so dealing with food justice, dealing with human rights issues, dealing with vegan human rights, animal rights issues, these are the voices that we want to center and listen to, not to the exclusion of, you know, anyone else, but we need to center these voices and listen, because, you know, it's sadly, we know the fact that it's often black and brown women and children that are being exploited mercilessly by corporations and by big business and us as consumers. The very little we can do about it is inform ourselves, have these discussions, not shy away from them, ask those questions, be accountable, try and find, you know, better ways that are solutions. And I've been going on now. I'm just going to wrap up now. So I've been doing, I said I'd try and wrap up within 30 minutes. Here we go on 40. We'll leave time for questions. Thank you ever so much for listening this far. What I just ask you to think of 5 points. Why should we consider human rights? Well, first of all, I think we need to be consistent. You know, animal rights come from human rights. Human rights built, animal rights is built on human rights. It's only in the last 50 years we've really seen animal rights. And it's come through people who've also developed human rights. And so we should be trying to be consistent. We should be aware of growth. We want to see this grow. So we have to listen to Black, Indigenous people of the global majority. We need to center and listen to those voices, pay attention, try and act accordingly. You know, and we just got to be better people. We want to be better people. We should all be trying to just be better people. That should be the daily mission, whatever your other goals, you know. And I think we all aspire to be better people, and that means, you know, upholding the rights of others less fortunate than ourselves, more vulnerable than ourselves, and much more innocent than ourselves. And we need to be mindful of that and make those choices and uphold the rights of those that have a right not to be used, and that's all of us. And we need to pass something on to the next generations. Quite honestly, I don't want my grandkids thinking that, you know, I was promoting child slavery to end cow abuse. That's not right. No, we've got solutions. So I want to pass on the right solutions, you know. So I want to live them now and pass them on whilst I've still got some breaths to take. And just one last thing, what about our own rights as humans? You know, how many of us have been in hospital recently? Well, there's a right, there's a human right. We have a human right for decent plant-based food. We should be mindful of that. We should be demanding that. What about the people in prison? What about the people in prison who've been denied plant-based options? We should be mindful of that. We should be fighting for those rights for prisoners to access plant-based food. Well, what about the care homes? This is scandalous. What about the rights of vegans in care homes? They're being fed meat That's a human right, atrocity. So, yeah, veganism, human rights, animal rights, they all tie up. Thank you for listening. I've just come in before there. You're very welcome to ask any questions if there's anything, or if you wanted me to clarify anything or challenge me to perhaps think about anything.
Thank you, Tim. And I think it was interesting at the end that you sort of brought it back to the human rights within veganism, which is slightly different from the human rights which may not be directly or what people would be thinking of as connected to veganism. Because obviously there's a human rights, you're right, for vegans to have vegan food, but then there's this separate question which you were quite focusing on, I know, and there has been in some of the discussions on the group about the slavery issue. I've got a whole load of things I've got written down there. As I put on the list, anybody got any questions, you can either write them down there or stick your hand up. Or yeah, I know John has always got something. Do you want to unmute yourself, John?
Yeah, I've got a question. It's tying in animal rights with human rights. Would you say that everybody should buy organic food? Because even if you're vegan, your food will be, if it's not organic, will be sprayed with pesticides, preservatives, which has a damaging effect on the producers, whether they're people in Europe producing it or people in developing countries. Particularly people in developing countries probably won't have all the face masks when they're spraying, etc. So if you're buying nice vegan food, but it's not organic, you're damaging the health of the people producing it, particularly in the developing countries. Would you say that should be an issue?
Well, it is an issue, and it's very much an issue if you look at some of the vegetable and fruit production. You know, as vegans, I think we're very much aware some of that is not environmentally friendly. There's also an abuse of human rights too. You know, there's poor workers' conditions. Veganic growing is generally, you know, the veganic growing is a growing movement. Obviously, there's a lot of solutions there. There's other ones like urban farming, vertical farming, the whole hydroponics. So there's some great technical developments too that would really do away with the need for so much chemical pesticides. And of course, chemical pesticides, fertilizers, of course, they should revert again to my favorite product, hemp, which is a farming, you know, absolute gold dust, because it actually does the opposite. It aerates the soil and it improves the soil, and it produces so much foliage which then falls off and you know, self composts. So you could grow hemp in a field, and a couple of years later it'll be sort of even better to perhaps grow other crops too. So it improves the soil. But absolutely, you know, but of course we're mindful of cost and availability, and there's no, whereas we should be looking always to try and source locally grown, organic, veganic options, because obviously not all organic is veganic. It may include animal manure or bone or that kind of thing. But veganic options, yeah, we should always be doing that. Of course, growing our own allotments, sprouting. I noticed Jill partly up there. Sprouting is, you know, imagine if it all does go a bit picked on and we're all in pretty much bunkers, you know, Jill and I will be all right. We'll be sprouting. We'll be living on sprouts. We won't have any problem. In fact, we'll be the only ones who'll be chatting as people who are on sprouts. You know. So very lively sprouts. So yes, it is a real issue, and it's something that, again, I think if we're not mindful and, as it were, holistic about our veganism, if we're not looking at the bigger picture, we're just focusing on one aspect of oppression and ignoring the other interconnected oppressions, of which damage to soil is a real oppressive issue. It's the wildlife. You know. So yes, but not to the exclusion of remembering that, you know, not everybody can afford this at this point, and not everybody can be available. We should certainly stop short of shaming people who are not able to access that level of food for any reason. especially budget right now, because it is expensive. You know.
Yeah.
Yep.
John, any other questions? While you're doing that, I'll just say back in, I think it was 1995, we attended a vegan festival over in the States. And up until then, I mean, my reason for going vegan was for the animals. And over there, over in California, there was a group of people who were sort of compassionate vegans. And I thought, well, maybe it's just a California thing, you know, a sort of, you know, hippie, I don't know. But it's interesting because obviously of recent years, there's been a lot of social justice campaigns, etc., whether it's Black Lives Matter and other issues that people, environment, of course. And I do wonder whether it's you know, more younger people are interested in those issues than perhaps some of those older vegans, and whether there's that aspect of it. And also there's a question about whether they feel, you know, because I mean, we've had this debate about Nestle and Kit Kat on the group, and this you know, people are putting on there. I mean, you know, rightly they told us, you know, about this child abuse and everything else that's been involved. I don't know if it's child abuse or whether it's been proven. Anyway, you probably can feel, I don't want to say anything that's libelous against Nestle, but there was some issue with the Nestle product. Some people were posting there with information about Nestle and baby milk. But even when people, you know, people just asking about where I can get the Kit Kat, it came as sort of like such a become zealous about the whole issue that they start attacking other people.
Yeah.
And there's a human rights issue in terms of globally and doing things to minimize the impact on human beings that are involved with being abused elsewhere. But then there's also the aspect of being kind and considerate to human beings who you are in connection with on your Facebook group or in social settings.
Oh, Brian, that's really relevant. I just going to go back to your first point about you know, is this a young thing or something? I think those of us who go back to the 80s, you know, if you remember that vegan thing then, it's just like full-on anarchist revolution, counter-revolution, underclass. You were signed up, paid up member just about, you know, every pressure group under the sun, or at least that's how I remember a lot of early vegan animal rights. So that, you know, the idea that kind of, you know, it's gone a bit full circles. It's sort of going around in circles a bit. What I think we have actually had is a backlash. And we've seen this in the last 5 years, and really that comes to a second point. So just to emphasize, really, I think we've always had a human rights protest aspect and a sort of underclass counter-revolution, really strong aspect. I think that's carried veganism, and I think we should honour that and respect that, and those pioneers, those animal rights protesters. You know, when I think about people who go to prison and who even, you know, get given their lives, who died, or been badly damaged, perhaps damaged for life. You know, these people carried this kind of whole thing. You think about someone like Mel Broughton, who's been imprisoned for 10 years and then just got kicked to death on a hunt, SABS, and nearly killed last year. I mean, that guy's paid a big price. So, you know, that struggle is being colossal. But yes, there's been a pushback on that. The last 5 years, we've seen what we basically have to call identity politics, weaponization of, and I will acknowledge my own part in that. It's 5 years since we did all that at our event, and we brought over a lot of really interesting speakers. As often happens, you know, a lot of good ideas and theory and ideology and such like then has to translate into practice. And so, you know, you can take some good ideas, but you've got to put them into practice, and that can be quite messy. And I think what we're seeing is a pushback against this idea that somehow human rights should be part of the debate, if you like. So when we come to something like Nestle, really what we need is a more nuanced
debate. And again, I'll give you credit here. I think 3 years ago, we wouldn't have seen that on London Vegans, Brian. We can have that kind of debate now because people have moved and grown and changed and listened and adapted as a group, as a collective. Some people have left because they haven't felt. But, you know, I see a better level of debate there. And part of that is because people, I think, are taking the trouble to understand that there are more than one opinion, and they don't necessarily have to contradict each other. They can complement each other sometimes, you know, and we don't have to have a polarized position. When you come to the Nestle, of course, there's benefits to Kit Kat, vegan Kit Kat. That's got a lot of benefits to making, you know, the whole vegan kind of normal, and you reach people and sort of, oh, you know, everything's going vegan. Even Kit Kats are going vegan. I mean, it's a great talking point. There's lots of benefits, and I think anybody arguing against the Nestle Kit Kat should listen to those and should consider them. But likewise, anybody arguing for the Nestle Kit Kat should consider: is there a better solution here, or is there a middle ground, or is there a way of actually listening and respecting people's opinions, while still having your own opinion, which might be slightly different to that? And of course, the answer is yes. We can always find that middle ground. We should seek that middle ground. And with the Nestle thing, I would say that, you know, part of the thing is there's solutions there. So I pointed to Dapper. You know, okay, Dapper's a luxury end. It's not in the high street supermarkets. It's online. Okay, all right. So you want some in the supermarket as well. The So Free range, you've got the Move Free range, that got the stamp, if you like. So I don't think this. I think quietly, we could tacitly, quietly acknowledge, oh, it's kind of cool that there's a vegan Kit Kat, but publicly we don't have to, you know, because think of this. Think of this now, you know, on London Vegans, there's you know, some people who's lost families to some atrocities that we are mocking and making light of. How's that spreading veganism in those communities? How's that making veganism a compassionate way of life that would seek to choose that? If we mock the very people who have suffered at the hands of oppression, and yeah, you know, we should be supportive of that, and we shouldn't just dismiss it. And I started my talk by saying one of the things I acknowledge is that, you know, sometimes some of this can be performative, and I think this is again something, Brian, that, you know, we see performative, what we call performative allyship. So people making, you know, virtue signaling. Oh, you know, oh, whatever, look at me, I'm standing for all of these things, and oh, what a virtuous person I am. But really, it's performative. We have seen that in some of the vegan groups, you know. Was their allyship performative? There's a question mark. What do we do about that? Well, you know, this stuff is uncomfortable, yes. So is it surprising? We don't want to go there. Mm. We have to train ourselves, we have to discipline ourselves. And yes, I think we do have to go there. We have to be prepared to act in solidarity with what's right. And it's not right to exploit humans for luxury items. It's not right to exploit the environment for luxury items. And if we, as a collective of vegans, can't get that right as a collective, what hope do we? What hope do we give to those who are yet to go vegan?
Yeah. We've got a couple of questions one from Alex, one from Paul. So Alex, I'll take yours first.
Hey Timbo, very interesting talk, and I like the links very much as well. Did you see today there's a story, it's the main story on Veg News, the big American vegan magazine that I used to write for. The story is that Gordon Ramsay is promoting an oat milk brand and saying some nice things about vegan in general. Apparently he's been encouraged by his kids. Would you want to engage with his family, or looking at the hideous meat-based menus in his restaurants, would you want to give him a berth, you know, thinking about Nestle, because he is the most influential chef in the world?
Right, that's a very good question, Alex. Thank you for asking that, because this is a challenge for all of us as advocates. And we know that across the board, so it's a very clever question because it applies across the board. Where do you compromise? You know, how far do you meet? Do you sit down with your enemy and talk to them, or do you throw stuff at them? You know, and if you sit down, do you compromise your own position and ideas in seeking, you know, progress and growth, or do you? That's a challenge, and that's not an easy one. Now, I mean, we've, again, just referring to Nestle, there has been, as you know, a conversation about should the vegan society trademark the Kit Kat, or should they remove the trademark in solidarity with the child slaves who've been denied the opportunity to take their slaves to court in the High Court in America. You know, in other words, do you get into bed with Kit Kat or not? Do you get into bed with the Gordon Ramsays or not? Well, here's an interesting one. You might have seen Ricky Gervais recently. Now, Ricky Gervais has been quite anti-vegan 5 years ago. Now Ricky Gervais is spearheading the Camp Vegan. You know, right, it's in the national papers, him and Peter Egan. And it's interesting that, you know, he's kept it quiet. Kind of, you know, Ricky and his wife did veganery, not last year, the year before. They went vegan. And although he doesn't admit to it, it was Peter Egan's influence. Peter and his wife had also sadly died now. You know, Ricky was resistant. I think he publicly said, "Oh, how much he likes cheese and all of this stuff." And of course, he does make the most vile, abusive jokes on TV. So he's challenged. Do you get into bed with the Ricky Gervais? He's vegan now, and he's advocating for Camp Vegan. So it shows that, you know, there's real progress to be made with controversial people. Will Gordon Ramsay, you know, how much would I personally? Yeah, probably his kids, to be honest, is the answer. It's like, yeah, listen, if your kids are, you know, just taking over the farm or growing a load of hemp, yeah, Gordon Ramsay, would you want to? Life short of that? So it's a good question now, Alex, and I think the answer is you have to, this is why I think it helps to have a better understanding of all of these things. Why I think it helps to keep plant-based diets and veganism as, you know, they're different but similar. Plant-based diets have great environmental health benefits. You don't actually have to be, you know, 100% plant-based to achieve all of that. With veganism, yeah, you do. You can't go around cutting up animals and going vegan. So, you know, it's important that we keep vegan clear. It's about a right for an animal not to be used. Every animal, all animals. But it's a birthright. It's one that we have a moral duty not only to recognise but uphold, and certainly not violate, and certainly not advocate that it's okay to violate. Plant-based diets is different. So, you know, if Gordon's bringing in a few plant-based options into his restaurants, well, that's a great thing. But it's nothing really to do with vegans. It's to do with more plant-based options, which is fabulous. And I'd say the same about Nestle and Kit Kat. Brilliant. Some more plant-based options. You can never argue with that. That's great as a default. Is it vegan? Oh, no way, Jose. You don't call that vegan. That's not my understanding of vegan. That's not what I signed up to. No chance. No. Not until they raise the standards. There's something about the horrific abuse of people and planet that they perpetrate daily as part of their business activities. No.
I've got another question, if that's okay. Let me ask, hopefully it's okay if I spotlight you. Paul, is that okay?
Yep, fine.
Far away, Paul.
Hey, Paul.
Hi, Tim, I wanted to ask you about the two magazines that VegFest UK have launched this year. Force the Vegan, which seems to be much more sort of rights oriented, whereas Plant Powered Planet seems to be more consumer oriented. What role do you see these magazines playing sort of within the vegan movement? Are they designed to complement existing publications, replace them? You know, what's the sort of rationale behind VegFest introducing these magazines?
Well, quite simply, because we are no longer able to run events. You know, we've lost our events. We're out of business. Have been for 18 months. So we're shut down, and we are unlikely to be able to get back to Olympia in a hurry. Vaccine passports and such like, tests. I don't know. It's very, very difficult. It's a year's work. We've lost our team. We've lost, the whole confidence of the trade has gone. The number of people we work with have now gone out of business. And the whole idea of doing an indoor event with a pandemic is still not on personally my agenda. I think it's irresponsible. I think we've seen that. Don't think there's time for it yet. 2023, yeah. So I'm hoping maybe in a year's time. But I don't think it'll be this year that we can start planning. It doesn't look like it. I don't know. It's a very difficult one to say. So we've been faced with survival. So certainly, are we intending to do anything with anyone else? No, it's not. And I'm thinking, we're not going to replace anybody. Will we complement? I don't know. There's nothing like Force of Vegan right now. There's no magazine like Force of Vegan that's working on that level that I see. Is that a good thing? Well, we hope so. We like doing it, that's for sure. Plant Planet is more of a sort of noted for consumer magazine. It's designed to promote, vegan options and sort of lifestyle choices. And we will come across probably, in fact, we already have. Alex has mentioned about, who do you say yes to? Who do you turn down? I mean, Force of Vegan will turn down anybody that really doesn't fit our criteria of being vegan. But, Plant Powered Planet would have a broader thing. So it's certainly not to replace. I mean, Vegan Life magazine, the Vegan Food and Living magazine, are both commercial print publications available in supermarkets and such. It's a whole different game. Completely different. We're not doing that. We're an online magazine. So no, we wouldn't replace them in any way. The vegan magazines and such like the Vegan Society magazine and Animal Aid and Viva are very much about their own achievements and goals and people they work with and such like. For obvious reasons, they're campaign groups. So no, we're kind of unique in that way, but we're very small. I would certainly request help at this point, and I'm not shy to ask if you'd like to, if you value those magazines. We're very early days. We're in a very tough competitive market, and it's incredibly hard to launch a business in this current climate. But what started off as literally a sketch on the back of the fag packet on Christmas Day is now translated into our 4th magazine being published next Tuesday. And I'm very happy with that achievement, and I'm very grateful for a number of people who contributed to it. We would definitely need support and help for it, so we'll be asking for things like voluntary subscriptions, businesses, charities to come on board, get involved and such like. But for now, if anybody wants to help distribute them, get them out into a few reading lists and put them around and discuss them. There's some fabulous content. They're all on the VegFest website. I'll drop it a link in a minute. Vegfest.co.uk, the magazines.
Yeah.
You can find them up there. And yeah, thanks. And Paul, just to let you, and I think it's your colleague Malcolm though too. Well, I haven't answered your email. I will answer your email about, and we will definitely include some brain study and health and some of the Oxford studies into future issues. It's been quite a challenge to get them. You know, there's a lot of work, but we've succeeded and we're there now. And I'd be, developing them further. So yeah, happy days, good times.
Okay.
I'm happy to stay on for another about 5 or 10 minutes or so, Tim. And there's a couple of questions on the chat box, and there's somebody else with a hand up. Are you okay?
Yeah, sure.
So it says, is there ever a time when the rights of humans should usurp the rights of animals? And it says, this would be used to argue for medical advancement, etc.
Right. Well, unfortunately, at the moment, human rights usurp animal rights consistently. I mean, very rarely do they not. And I think we've seen this with the vaccine. We know that the vaccine's been developed not only with a lot of animal testing, but every batch that goes out is tested on animals. So by nature, if you make a choice to have the vaccine, you are, in a very tiny way, increasing the amount of animals experimented on. That's the fact. So that's the decision you make, whether to usurp animal rights for the sake of human rights, which obviously to have the vaccine to prevent people getting ill, prevent maybe killing people. It's a very big reason. But it's your choice currently, and therefore we have that. Absolutely, all of us right now, as it were, in this little era of this current 2021. It's a choice for all of us. Do we choose human rights to protect human communities over animal rights, which is using a product that not only was tested on animals in its development, but it's been tested before each batch has been released to make sure it's up for killing humans. So it's a big deal. I think for a lot of us who have to use life-saving medicine or pain-killing medicine or condition-stabilizing medicine, we don't have a choice. We have to consider the wherever practicable and possible definition. We have to be comfortable with that because we don't have a choice. We have to choose to take that to maintain health. So, that's I won't say it's fine because it's not fine for those animals, but it's from a vegan perspective, it's understood. And certainly anybody else who uses life-saving medicine to make them any less vegan. Nor does anybody choosing the vaccine make them any less vegan. But do human rights usurp those animal rights? They do, yeah. Can we find alternatives? Yes, and there are lots, and that's what we should be looking at, the solutions. And that kind of just brings me to all of these things about human rights. There's always a solution. The vegans should seek the solution by default. We should never settle for whatever. We should always, if we do, we should always, part of us should be by default seeking the solution, the true vegan option. And partly I'd liken this a little bit to snails. Every vegan, like we have this thing, the snails come out, don't we? None of us want to hear that crunch. So, it's been raining, it's warm, we have snails out tonight. So if you're going out for a little walk afterwards, what do? You just, never mind, just, tough. Crack on. Not very vegan, but well, I've got places to go, so hopefully. Or do you go, no, I'm vegan, I'm not going to go out, I don't want to risk stepping in the snail, I know they're out there, it's the time. So we don't take the middle path. It's look, I'm going to go out, I'm vegan, I'm going to be mindful. Yeah, do my best and keep an eye out, be mindful, try and avoid stepping on a beautiful little wonderful creature. We really appreciate me being mindful and not stepping on them. And that's what I think with human rights. and vegan choices. This is where we should be trying to choose that middle path. It shouldn't stop us, but we have to try and not step on the snake. And if that means not choosing a product that we know involves human rights abuses, then we should be making that choice wherever practical and possible.
Good point. Last question, Margaret Lee.
Thank you. As everyone in the group knows, I'm from New York City. This is a bit of a practical question that involves money. I don't know if this happens much in London, but in New York City, you can't walk a block without some usually it's a young person approaching you for some good cause. And most often these causes are human-oriented causes, often to help underprivileged children. And yesterday, in fact, this happened where there was a young woman who happened to be vegan. I mean, just by a miracle, she happened to be vegan, but she was representing a group called CARE, which offers help to underprivileged children. And so I listened to her, of course, being a vegan, of course I was going to listen to her spiel. And so she told me about this organization, and she said, well, is there any reason why you would not want to support this group? And I said, and I always wear a vegan hat when I go out. I'm very much identified as vegan. And I said, well, it was one vegan to another. I'll tell you, I'm really more about animals than I am about people. I'm very much obsessed about keeping my money as much as possible out of anything that would be of a damaging thing to animals. And so in the question of your group providing food for children, I would imagine that there's quite a lot of animal eating in that, and so I would have a problem with that. So do you feel I'm going too far? Do you think that I'm a callous person, or what would your view be?
And it's the same argument for a lot of these things. Is you don't want to finance more exploitation. You don't want to put your money into a business or a charity that's going to go out and kill a load of animals. That's your default, and that's absolutely should be a principle that we should try and uphold as a default, without a doubt, because that's a vegan principle and it's the core vegan principle. But this is the beauty of then this is why we should support the little, we should keep an eye out for the little initiatives, the ones that are growing, because they turn into the bigger ones that we can then all turn to. But we've got fantastic options. So like in New York, I mean, Chili's on Wheels. Chili's on Wheels would go out and feed homeless people with a lot less, people absolutely desperate just to eat. And they will go out with vegan feeding programs. And now they've grown in 8 years. Michelle Carrera is this incredible dynamic person who's grown this. And now they have this wonderful person, Eloisa, who does a lot of outreach in New York. They've opened a plant-based kitchen, fridge, where people can just go up, get food for free, communities, feed them all through the pandemic. And in England, we've got a vegan compassion group that have been doing similar. We've got a Well-Fed World, which is a huge international group that feed vegan all over the world. $1 million vegan, all credit. They are now feeding 1 million plant-based meals all over the world, including Gaza, which talk about human rights. There's a brave team that's going in. And these are the things, Gaza, they're plant lantern. You don't have to get involved with the politics. You don't have to have a position. You can just support people going out, dodging the bombs and the bullets, and feeding people with plant-based options. That's solidarity. And as long as there are plant-based options, there's so many fabulous human rights organisations that we can support if we've got a budget. But I would say that as an individual, we've all got tiny, whatever money we've got, it's tiny, a tiny job. How we choose to spend it, you know, if it's for animals and it's consistent with human rights and animal rights, there's the solution. And there's so many springing up, and it's up to us to support them, really, you know. No more Nestle. Let's support DAPA, you know, why not? They'll really appreciate it. So it's a brilliant question. Chilies on wheels in New York City, fabulous.
Yes, they're fabulous. They're fabulous. And that's the kind of thing that I want to support. I even told my church that I would not give them any money at all because of their perspective on animals.
Yeah.
You know, at the social hour, they serve animal products, and I wouldn't want any of my money to go into,
There's a good point, because with your religious group, with your church, I'm sure that your church is very much supporters of human rights and especially childcare programs. So this is where our veganism pays off to be consistent, because if you're putting forward vegan solutions for the animals that also uphold human rights, then your receptive audience of your church will see the consistency and be more approachable to the idea of recognizing animal rights if you're also recognizing human rights. So I think that underlines a really good point, that if we want to attract especially other caring, compassionate people, like a church, like a group of, you know, we need to be consistent, and we need to demonstrate that. And that's why people like Food Empowerment Project, Chilies on Wheels, you know, fundamentally so good to promote.
Thank you, Tim. I'm going to say thank you for all the people who've been contributing to the discussion with your questions. Thank you, Tim, for giving us your views. Hopefully we'll start thinking about more than just the animal issue when we're buying products and services that are vegan or plant-based, because it can go beyond you know, the animal issue. Oh, there's some feedback there. I'm just before we close down the formal part, can I just say I have a round of applause for Tim for participating today. Thank you.
Thank you.